Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Miller from Appalachia Technologies. I thank you for being here. I am really excited to do this webinar today. We have some amazing people that are with us, and we're going to bring them on stage for a sec. We're going to bring them on stage here in a second. But today's topic is going to be about a little bit of sub GRC, right? PCI compliance. And if you're not familiar with it right now, you should be by the end of this conversation. So today I have with me my team, Yoel Alvarez, which will be on stage here in a second, Jimmy Armour, Ashley Loudon, and a special guest today, we have John Sisco from Wendy's Corporation. So hopefully you brought your lunch. Hopefully it's Wendy's. And from there, I believe Ashley's going to bring everybody on stage, and we're going to get the party started. All right. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. Awesome. How are you guys?
Doing well.
Loving it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining today. I'm really excited to get this kicked off. And I think we're just going to dive right into it because we have a lot to cover in such a short amount of time. I wish I had hours with all of you, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way. So I thought I would kind of kick this off by, obviously today's webinar is about PCI compliance. And there may be some in this room watching that don't even know what PCI compliance is. And I'm sure that there's others watching as well that work in it and around it every day. So I thought I would ask one of you, and maybe I'll hand this one to you. What do, and we're going to do introductions right after that, but right here at first, let's talk about what PCI actually is. If you can give us the brief of that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'd love to. PCI in general can be described as one of the standards used to protect your environment in general, but more specific to payment card information or personal identifiable information. It's a standard that it is now on version number 4, quite extensive. I have personally been involved with it since version 1 in one way or another. So I've seen it grow to what it is today. It can be, a full-time job if you really commit and you're passionate about it. And often it's also found as this was just landed here to me. Let's see how we can fix it. So it's all about protecting and safeguarding sensitive information. And it does give you a highlight of all the steps that you have to comply with to call yourself compliant with PCI.
Yep, you're exactly right. And most people don't think about when you go somewhere, whether it's a restaurant, a retail place, or an online service, when you swipe your credit card, how is that card data being protected? So thank you, Yoel, for kicking that off. And I'm going to back up just for a second. And I would like to just do, a 60-second introduction with each of you. If we could maybe just go around the room. And John, I'm gonna hit you first, if that's okay. If you just want to give an intro, it'd be fantastic.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I've been with Wendy's company about 2 years, an internal security assessor. Primarily, one of my bigger responsibilities is PCI DSS, kind of governance risk compliance. I also do third-party risk management. We're kind of a small team, but we cover all of it. And basically just my background, I've got about almost 10 to 15 years, give or take, of governance risk compliance. I've had a few times where I've taken other roles, when economy was tough. But overall, that's my main focus. But I do come from originally being more like a desktop support and a network administrator. And that's I guess the best way to describe it. Trying to keep
that's a great background because I'm sure you have a lot of understanding when you're reading the controls, what they actually mean. So thank you for that intro. Sure. Jimmy, I'm going to let you go next.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. My name is Jimmy Armour. I'm a VCISO and senior security consultant for Appalachia Technologies. I've been with Appalachia for just over 2.5 years, I believe, at this point. Where when I made the switch, I started focusing mainly on GRC, doing framework assessments, helping clients write policies, really just achieve overall cybersecurity maturity, implement a broader governance risk compliance program. Before that, I was with another consulting organization, largely focusing on endpoint, very technical implementations, spanning EDR and the like. But that's really where my background is.
Awesome. Thank you, Jimmy. I really appreciate having you today. Yoel.
Hey everyone, again, Joel Alvarez with Appalachia, same role as Jimmy, senior security consultant and also providing vCISO services for our clients. And I love the combination of effort between compliance in general and the GRC world. So it's quite exciting to help clients achieve that mature level or get to a higher level of knowledge in terms of cybersecurity and best practices in general through assessments, either through risk or just best practices, like I said. But I've been with Appalachia now for 2 years, and before that, I was working in hospitality for close to 10 years. My previous employer was all about PCI from day one, so yeah, I got to play hands-on with seeing it evolve from a very entry level of experience to a more mature program towards my I would say 10th year in that company, and then seeing that now from the consulting side, I get to play with a more diverse set of industries and clients, and I love every minute of it.
Well, that's awesome. And from working with both of you, you were both very passionate about what you do. So again, you all, thank you for being here as well. And I would not be doing justice if I did not give Ashley a chance to introduce herself. If it wouldn't be for her, we wouldn't be doing this. She's normally the back end of all of this, making all of this happen. So Ashley, it's your moment.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Thanks for that intro, Mike. My name is Ashley Loudon. I work with Appalachia Technologies. And today for this webinar, I will be your technical moderator. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. I'll be sharing them with the group. And just a reminder, this conversation, if you're tuning in through LinkedIn, through YouTube, the conversation and comments will continue. So if you see something in there today, it may get answered within a couple of days. So it's great to have that ongoing conversation.
Thank you. And yes, our goal for today is really to have this an open conversation. So interrupt us with your comments. Some of them we can bring on screen, and we can dive down some of those and answer some questions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started because we have some pretty interesting questions and topics that we would like to talk about regarding PCI. So John, I'm going to roll back to you here for a second. And when you think about PCI and you think about security, a lot of times, if you were to get a penetration test, that's a test that's a point in time. You get that penetration test done, you get the results back, you see where you stand. That's a firm point in time, right? Well, with GRC, especially with PCI compliance, it is an ever-living process. You don't just get you don't get compliant and then just walk away from it for the rest of that year. So how do you as an organization keep on track and realize that PCI is an ongoing kind of everlasting function that lives every single day?
It has to be made into a program. You have to have executive buy-in, really going all the way up to the C level. Realize and help them to understand the metrics and how it actually impacts the business. Matter of fact, like with a payment card brand, if you aren't compliant or it's an acquirer, you may get fined. And so there's all these different things if you're not compliant. One thing I've found that very helpful for us is that, having some type of a GRC tool that has automated things that you need, like it might be your firewall scans, your vulnerability scans. You get them throughout the year at points in time when you need them. Our pen tests, we actually, have pen tests coordinated with our internal red team that allows us to, do the tests that are applicable, not only just for scope, but for the environments that we cover. And so it's all those things, every day, you just have to really make sure that you have a regular program. And as was mentioned before, it's the type of thing where, the versions are always going. I mean, we have version 4.0, but come December, we have version 4.0.1 with some enhancements, and there's FAQs. So there's so many different things happening that the council will make changes to keep abreast, and it's just ongoing.
Yeah, it is definitely something that you have to work at. Nathaniel in the comments that PCI is all day, every day. And I think that's a very true, well said comment. So thank you, John. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Jimmy, that kind of leads me into my next question, which I think is going to fit you really well, right? So in cybersecurity, we are, sometimes we as a cybersecurity team get known as the people who want to stop things or shut things down, right? And sometimes it's those obstacles that we have to get over. So But really, cybersecurity is part of the business. It's to enable the business as well. So how does an organization strike a balance between risk mitigation and business enablement when navigating the PCI controls and compliance in general?
Yeah, it's such a difficult task, right? And it's something that's definitely achievable, but it's an ongoing thing that you're going to have to, or you're going to struggle with all of the time, right? Leadership changes, the business changes, right? It's something that you're gonna have to constantly take a look at, constantly look at, involve or evolve with the business. But it's like walking a tightrope, right? It starts with a clear understanding of your business objectives. What are you trying to achieve from a business perspective, right? What is the business doing? How does the business make money? Then you need to, identify what the risks are that would hinder those specific objectives, right? Risk identification, evaluation, all that type of stuff. Effectively, risk and implementing controls around risk, a lot of times people view it as stopping things. A greater way to look at it is more like a seatbelt in a car, right? A seatbelt doesn't stop you from being able to drive, but it's a control in place to increase the safety of the driving activity. So that's generally how I like to look at compliance. But there are definitely situations you come into where you can't do certain things if you want to be compliant. But the goal is not to hinder, it's to just try to control and make sure and ensure compliance. So, as to John said, you don't get fined or worse, right? It's for some of the news stories that's come out. But yeah, it definitely want to make sure that you're enabling the business and not hindering as much as possible.
I agree. Would any others like to make any comments on that?
Um,
You're well, John.
I mean, for my part, I think that you really have to work at showing, cybersecurity and particularly governance risk compliance as a business enabler. And, it's true, it doesn't make revenue, but, the other side of it is just as was mentioned with the last comment, it's kind of just like with a car. If you don't put the brakes on, you don't have controls on, and you're driving a Corvette and you have cruddy brakes, it's going to end up into the side of the road and crash. Well, at some point you have to somehow keep everything on the road. Some companies have a much more aggressive, shall we say, cyber appetite, but the bottom line is that, there has to be controls. And then ultimately it is the business that decides, but you can't stack security side by side and say that it's a money maker, but it is an enabler. And that's the point that we have to remember. It's just like IT. IT is an enabler. It's actually the information. It's kind of like plumbing. If you have plumbing in your house, you have to have the water get where it needs to go so that you can do the things you need to do. Well, you need, your data and other things to get where they need to be able to make your money with them, but you still want to protect that. So it's kind of striking that balance. Will a breach happen? It may. Maybe there's going to be a security incident, but ultimately, what controls do you have around it?
Yeah, I love that. And you always hear, compliance doesn't mean security, which is absolutely true. But John, just kind of backing up what you said, compliance does drive security. And you will find, in our business, we see it all the time. Most organizations don't spend money because they want to. They spend money because they're forced to for compliance. So in a way, compliance, PCI is definitely a way, like you said, John, to get things done, because I guarantee there are things in place at businesses and organizations to protect data that if there was not compliant, or if there wasn't compliance driving that, those things would not be in place. So many of the organizations, Wendy is obviously going to have a very secure, or I'm sorry, very mature PCI strategy. And many of the customers that we work with have a very mature strategy as well. So, I'm going to aim this one, excuse me, toward you. So a company is brand new to PCI. Maybe it's a startup company. Maybe it's a company that just came on the radar for PCI, and all of a sudden they're getting told that they need to become PCI compliant. So where does an organization even start, right, to understand compliance and to take the first steps in building a compliance strategy?
Yeah, that's we can bundle multiple of those into a full conversation here, but keeping it simple and short is if you start by being aware that you have to be PCI compliant, that's already 50% of the battle won, right? We stumble upon clients and situations where they're let known by a third party or someone enforcing that level, saying, hey, you have to be. And if you are totally unaware of the standard itself, the level of effort, the complexities, the political side that may bring in when you have to present, hey, we now have to be compliant with this, that's a battle quite tough to actually engage. But once you're like starting with PCI, okay, this is my environment now, I have to be compliant, is first getting to be familiar with the standard itself, getting to be familiar with the way it mandates certain aspects. Who do you have to report to? The level of tiers that you have to be involved, depending on the size of your business. And once you are familiar with all of that environment of what it entitles to be PCI compliant, then it becomes your level of depth of knowledge of, is my environment ready to be called PCI compliant? So your whole conversation should be about determining what's in scope, what is actually part of my PCI compliance environment, also known as my card data environment, and then what is my level of compliance? Either you have the knowledge in-house to really assess how secure is your environment, or do you leverage a third party to help you find that, or even help you develop that scope that you have within PCI? So yeah, that'll be my first step, right? Be familiar with it, then get to know the level of maturity that my environment has, PCI maturity or PCI compliance wise, and then being able to develop a roadmap that if I am not compliant, then how do I get there? The level of effort, who needs to be involved? Do I need, again, to grow my team? Like John was mentioning there, dedicate people specifically just for that effort for PCI compliance, or can I leverage other areas or other third parties to help me get there? That would be my first step, is get familiar with where I am and what do I need to know about PCI.
I love that. And I agree with what you said. 50% of it is admitting that you need to be PCI compliant.
Oh,
right?
what do you mean?
First step, admitting you have a problem, and then trying to solve that problem. Would anyone else like to chime in on that?
I would just say, one of the biggest things is you also need to kind of, as you're starting out, and once you get that buy-in from executive management, you kind of need to know what you have to protect. And I saw somebody put a comment up in there about inventory. Well, inventory of where your data is probably one of the most critical things first. If you don't know where your credit card data is, where your sensitive authentication data, your SAT is, all these different things, well, it's important to really know that so that you can scope your program. And, in order to scope a program, you really need to be able to, first of all, define what your cardholder data environment is, the CDE. And that way you're going to know what you need to protect. And with new requirements coming up, there's one for knowing when you have credit card data that's outside of your authorized zones. Well, how are you going to meet that requirement if you don't know where your data is? So that's a big part of it, is scoping, and it can actually reduce the level of effort. Like, say, for example, you don't store, credit card holder data. Well, you could get rid of a lot of requirement 3, but then, of course, you're also more secure. So sometimes even, doing your scoping correctly actually makes you more secure, but it also reduces the level of effort that you have to meet, to meet the compliance.
Yeah, and I know, John, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you too.
Sorry about that. Jumping
point. Ahead. No, it's fantastic. It kind of leads into that, right? Not even just in PCI compliance, but in general, if you don't have proper inventory of your digital assets or the digital assets on your network, how can you protect those, right? It's impossible. So one of the first steps is getting proper inventory of all of your digital assets. And I can tell you from experience, and I'm sure everybody in this room on this panel will probably tell you that 80% and probably 90% of the organizations out there do not have proper inventory. And assessments that I've done in the past, I'll ask for an inventory spreadsheet or some type of inventory list, and I get it, and the date's 2013, and there's one category, and it's just 10 servers, right? But what about everything else? What about the 100 VMs that are on those 10 servers, and things like that? So, yeah, John, I think that's a great point that you made as far as the inventory. And I really think that's, for me, if there's a single takeaway that you have from this webinar, I think that's one of the most important, is knowing your digital assets, right? I think it's extremely important. Any other points you guys want to make on that? Okay. Jimmy, I'm going to hit you with the next one. In your view, what are the key components of a successful risk and compliance program, and how can they be adapted to industry-specific challenges such as those, in the payment industry?
Yeah, and I think it's a big challenge for everybody, right? And it's not going to look the same for everybody because everybody's industry is not the same. The business that you're trying to support is not the same. But generally speaking, good components of a GRC program, as we've noted multiple times before, you need buy-in from leadership, right? If you don't have buy-in from leadership, it's going to be an uphill battle, and you're probably not going to have an effective program. Second, you need a clear understanding, and usually this is working with your senior leadership on what the risk appetite is for the organization specifically. And it can change, right, from risk to risk. The appetite might adjust. The cost to reduce a risk might be too much, so you decide to accept, right, or any other of the risk addressing strategies that you might take. But outside of that, you need a really robust risk assessment process, right? Risk identification is key. If you don't have visibility, we talked about inventory, right? If you don't have visibility into what you're trying to protect, where you're trying to protect it, who you're trying to protect it from, and I think someone mentioned before, inventory of people, process, technologies. Is it Nathaniel? A mainstay here, making some awesome comments. But yeah, inventory of people, process, and technologies, right? If you don't know where the data is, if you don't know the technology that you're interacting with, the different departments, where there's human intervention, you're not going to have a good view of where the risks might be from a technological perspective or not, right? Then you need to have a really robust risk evaluation process. Once the risk is identified, how do you categorically compare apples to apples with other risks, right? How do you communicate it from a business perspective once it's evaluated? Do you have a rubric, right? Do you have a spelled out rubric so that you can actually get a quantitative assessment of what that risk is? And then once you have the quantitative risk assessment and you're looking to compare risk scores of different risks, maybe you say, hey, this is a risk score of 80, right? It's really bad. We want to reduce it. Well, then comes in the question of what the risk appetite for that particular risk is. What are the resources? What's the cost? What's the timeline to reduce that risk to whatever the acceptable level may be? Maybe the acceptable level is a 20. Maybe it's not. Now, in some cases, like PCI, there's non-negotiables, right? You need to be compliant, so you're required to do certain things. In other areas, maybe not, right? Maybe you have some leeway in what you want that risk score to be. But in terms of specific compliance frameworks like PCI, in some cases you don't have a say. You need to be compliant, or you risk the chance of getting fined, right? And no one wants fines.
Absolutely. And a takeaway that I got from that, Jimmy, is, it's not just about the technology. It's about understanding the business as well. So in this field, we have what we call QSAs, right? Who come on site or virtually now, and they help a large organization get their report on compliance. But when those QSAs come in to audit your network, they don't just have to have an understanding of the technicalities of your network. They need to also have an understanding of your business as well. So, Yoel, John, any other comments? Anything you'd like to add to any of that?
Yeah, I can speak a bit on that, Jimmy. And in terms of appetite, I find per experience here that often comes after you have the threat of a fine or the fine actually taking place to develop some appetite, gain some traction. That happens to be, of course, a big motivation when you have multiple merchant IDs, and usually the fines are attached to how many merchants IDs you have. So it's not a once and a thing. It's going to be a monthly recurrent fine that you pay based on how many merchants IDs your business has. And in terms of the appetite to go back and implement, that's going to be your first comparison numbers. Like, I'm paying so much in fines. This is how much I save the company if we get to compliance level X. And this isn't talking about a breach or something related to data theft that, of course, has more involvement from the rest of the company, but it's just an opening statement as where to develop that appetite.
And I would agree with Yoel and Jimmy. I mean, it just comes down to, how well defined is that risk appetite? What are they willing to go with? And then of course, how many exceptions, for your tolerance? How many times are you willing to go over that? And those are the things that you have to define. And a lot of times, even trying to get quantitative analysis, it's not always so easy to just get quantitative. A lot of times there is a qualitative element as well. So, depending on, what you have defined, and it all comes down to inventory again. Sometimes there are sections, like in companies where maybe one area is more mature than another and some aren't. So, just stepping outside of PCI DSS, maybe a company has a real good inventory of what they have for PCI DSS because they have to. But what about your other types of data that have PII and things like that? So there's a lot going into it all the way around.
Yeah, and I like bringing it back to inventory again, just how important that is. So to satisfy some, dive a little bit deeper, just for a brief moment, I would like to get maybe dive down some of these controls. And John, this one is for you. Over the past decade, we've seen more and more applications and application security become part of the bigger picture of cybersecurity because web applications are being developed, and they are not always developed with security in mind. So there have been some changes to the PCI DSS, and one of the questions I have for you is, what are some of the new challenges facing organizations regarding their web application security when as they're processing credit cards, specifically for the new version that come out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, here's a couple of requirements highlighting, like 6.3.2 has an inventory. We get back to inventory, a bespoke and custom software. Well, bespoke is something that you develop within your own environment. Custom, actually, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Bespoke is something that's developed for the entity by a third party, but the custom software is things that you develop yourself. But getting an inventory can be quite challenging, and it's a good practice because, when you don't have a good inventory, of what's involved with your software, like including libraries, APIs, other things, you run into situations where, you can have software supply chain issues that could compromise, your company. And then another one is a requirement about public-facing web applications, like you mentioned. Now, at a high level, most companies would probably go with a WAF, like a web application firewall. But the reason why that's so critical is, let's face it, even if you have a good secure development, you're doing static and, also, dynamic scanning of your apps. You might not catch them all. And the web application firewall might block an attack like SQL injection or, cross-site scripting, some of the, typical things you would see on OWASP top 10. So that's absolutely critical. And then another one that they've added in that has to be these are all by 2025 of March that we have to have in place, but, organizations, but is also like one revolving scripts that are loaded inside the actual browser when the client comes through. Do you have an inventory of them? Do you have, also, some of the, basically file integrity monitoring in place for that, because scripts could be taken, even if they're legitimate scripts, it could be taken over by somebody and used to inject malware and then cause card skimming, so there's so many different things, and that's just real high level, obviously, but it creates a lot of extra things that need to be met, and it's a good thing that they're implementing them, quite frankly, because if you don't, you're going to have bigger problems. So
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And by implementing these requirements, it once again forces these organizations to put certain controls in place, around that software development that might not have been there before. So I love all of the engagement. Keep it coming. If anyone has any specific questions, feel free, get the engagement rolling. We'd be more than happy to answer them to you or for you. Yoel, I'm going to roll back around to you. So, we have the rise of mobile wallets. I'll pull into a fast food restaurant and I'll tap my phone, and we have a different way of transmitting this information now. So how do we how do we make sure that we are innovating our systems and our protective processes to align with how do we keep up with that?
That's an excellent question, and we can use multiple examples like the tap to pay or the chip or the pin. For the longest time, and this is going back multiple versions of PCI, of course, we were mandated to follow certain standards and certain vendors for specific technology. But it wasn't until tokenization and point-to-point encryption became almost a standard that those payment solutions were not updated. So you had a delay between the standard that was being published in PCI DSS and the technology able to support it to be able to capture those payments. So you may wonder at that point as a business person is like, do I lose this client because I don't have the interface that they're used to pay with at that point? So thankfully, a lot of that has been actually more to a level in the latest versions of PCI where they're actually catching up with that. A clear example is on the early versions, it basically mentioned that your antivirus had to have like scanning or it had to have like a database of block lists. And it only took 2 or 3 versions to get to the point that an EDR actually will suffice the compliance requirement. So with that sentiment, we see a lot of the point of sale or the card swipe vendors or the actual online portals for online stores accepting more and more forms of payment. There was a time that they were dabbling with digital currencies. If you were able to pay or not, how do we make that compliant? How do we take some of that information that is usually not available for the average person buying things and making compliant too? So I definitely applaud what the council is doing, evolving and adding more things, staying ahead of those upcoming changes, taking a bigger look at the market in general, where like new generations are not carrying cash. They don't necessarily want to pay with a card. They want to pay with the phone and move on to the next thing they're doing. So again, I applaud them. I think that it has come a long way. Are we there yet? I don't think so. Like unified payment solutions, meaning that the banks have to be able to accept it. In this case, we call them payment gateways or processors. Sometimes being the same bank, but we often see it being a separate third party that they interface with your other systems, collecting the payment and sending it. I think that where we're struggling the most is with the new variety of forms of payments that we're going to be having soon here. Not just paying with your phone, but being able to pay from a single like barcode, everything attached to a single account. You have to be able to have that integrated into your payment solution. The days of me having to swipe are gone, and now you have to insert and enter your PIN. So it takes a cultural shift, as you can see. Technology evolves, and we are now seeing that being actually more in line with the evolution of those. Another quite challenging environment is you also have to account that you have to replace a lot of technology to accommodate the new forms of payments. So when you have a business that has to rely on an investment to get up to speed with new interfaces, with new technology, with new ways of accepting that payment, and now you are asking them that you have to basically renew your full point of sale stack or your full form of payment, or you have to now be compliant with this new requirements coming in March 2025, there's a lot of that catching up that I think is going to be lagging behind what we see the standard now being able to accept. Not to add to what Jimmy was saying, right? It's going to be challenging, but you have to be aware of these changes, especially if you're in charge of forecasting the budget, forecasting what might be subject to change compliance-wise real soon. So try to be up to date with that information, especially if it requires you buying new technology to be compatible with.
I love that. And it's going to be interesting, Yoel, to see where we're at even 5 years from now, as far as the unified payment solutions and the controls and so on. Anything else? I see there's a question up on the screen, but before we get to that, Jimmy or John, anything you want to add to Yoel's statement? Okay. If not, John, I'm going to aim this question back to you, right? So obviously everybody here knows you're with Wendy. It's a very large organization. But how do you communicate to SMBs, right? The small, medium-sized businesses, the importance of security best practices within the PCI DSS without overwhelming them? Because many times in these organizations, you don't have a huge security team. You don't have a huge compliance team. So, how would you answer that question?
Well, I mean, I think in some cases, you may have to consider, maybe a managed service provider in some instances, or, in some instances, I'm just going to say at a high level, Wendy's is a service provider for our franchisees. So we help them to actually meet parts of the compliance that they need. And they usually will fill out like a, SAQ. And we've had times where we consult with them and we help them. But, like you said, some of these, franchisees, they might own 50 stores. They might only own 10. They might only own 15. And, they have to be in compliance for that. And sometimes it's funny, but the things that we help them with, they actually have more than just a Wendy's franchise. So, overall, you have to sometimes, gauge what would be the most affordable solution and what you can do to descope. Again, that comes down to a lot of affordability as well. If you can transfer some of that compliance on another organization, like if you have point-to-point encryption enabled from your POS terminals, or from your web, or mobile app transactions, that cuts out some of the things that you need to meet. Obviously it's still expensive, but you have to analyze all those things. But again, it just comes down to knowing what your risks are and what you can afford. So you have to establish all those baselines. And sometimes there's no easy answer. I mean, the bottom line is that it's going to cost money, but you have to kind of gauge and see what they're willing to spend and try to find ways to help them save money where you can.
Yeah, you have to help them. You have to understand the business. Like you said, you have to educate so that you can help them or give them information they need to help them make those particular decisions. So,
right.
So I saw something way earlier in the comments, and it's been on the back of my mind for one of you to explain. Maybe it's John, Jimmy, Yoel, whoever. The word tokenization came up, and many people don't have an understanding of what that actually is. Can any of you possibly explain that in a way, briefly, that can help a person understand what that means? Yeah, I knew you were going to raise your hand for that one, Yoel. I knew it.
I saw it from the moment it was still an idea to it was fully realized, and it was a game changer. I'm going to preface that a little bit with what it means having a token instead of the full credit card information, right? It means that if someone is able to steal the information, they're not stealing actual credit card or sensitive data. It's something that the bank or the processor created for the sake of interfacing with your payment information. And if it's exposed, which we know in security is a matter of time, you're not going to have sensitive data compromised. That is the short version of it. Now, without getting too technical, how it happens is at the moment of you inserting your information on one of those point of sale stations or entering that on a website that has a secure portal to capture your payment information, when that is sent to the processor to actually charge the card or the account in question here, the information sent back to verify that transaction is actually a token that replaces what was sent in fully encrypted originally. So from that moment on, whenever we actually use that transaction, is that fake number or token that replaces that information and takes place. So again, to keep it protected, and if stolen, is not going to be the sensitive information being sent out. That's the term of tokenization, turning that sensitive information into that new token to address it.
I love it. You actually explained that extremely well, Yoel. Thank you.
Thank you.
We see the term a lot, and many just don't understand that. So I think that's a huge answer there. So I have a question from Jacob Hill, a good friend of mine. For an e-commerce website, if they're using PayPal, Stripe, some other third party to process payments, what else needs to be done from a PCI DSS standpoint? And I'm not anymore. Way back, I was a QSA, and this was something that I used to run into years ago, where people would say, "Oh, we're not processing the card or what have you." So, it was always debatable whether it was in scope or not in scope. So, any of you, if you'd like to kind of take this question, that would be fantastic.
All right. Well, I mean, right out of the gate, I mean, first of all, any payment processor you have, you have to at least get their attestation of compliance and, obviously like the third party, concerns. But again, it comes down to, are you hosting maybe their payment portal within your web portal? and so you might have to make sure that your web portal that is, having, that section of their website in there to be compliant. I mean, this is just obviously not going deep dive, but it's so important to make sure that every element that's part of that is, deciding what is in scope and what you need to meet. So, it comes down to the scoping and, so if it's like an iframe or something like that. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll take other comments from, the other folks too, just to see if I'm correct, but that's kind of the first things right out of the gate that come into my mind.
No, I agree with you. I think you nailed it. I will just add to the evolution of the actual PCI DSS versions. We have seen the development of new forms of SAQs that help you determine what you have to be compliant with. That wasn't the case on the early versions, but nowadays with all of the other forms of capturing that payment information, they have actually itemized it. So if you're like an online only portal, you use a third party for the service and you have this type of transactions only as the one allows, well, this is a type of SAQ or self-assessment questionnaire that you need to fill out. And that usually is pretty extensive in all the things that you need to do, especially for that MID or their merchant ID specifically applied to that portal. If you want to go beyond that, that's where we need to dive into the GRC roles and what other standards do I use for my global enterprise rather than just that scope specifically.
I love that. Jimmy, anything there?
No, I think they both hit on it very well.
Awesome. Next question's coming to you anyhow. We a few times over the past 40 minutes, third parties have been mentioned. And we know that the risk of third parties it's really unreal at this point. It's overlooked. Many times relationships are established with third parties without proper due diligence and so on. So, with the increased risk of third-party vendors, how does an organization manage that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think you kind of hit on it. The answer is you just have to do your due diligence, right? Now there are tons of different definitions of due diligence, and lawyers argue what is required. What due diligence is required, what counts as due diligence, what doesn't. But effectively, you need to figure out and perform your own due diligence to be able to meet PCI compliance. In the realm of third parties, I mean, I think third party risk management kind of blew up ever since, what was it, 2013 or so, the Target breach. At least that's the biggest one that I feel like started
HVAC company.
the big snowball rolling down the mountain, right? It was definitely a thing before then, but I think it kind of threw it to the forefront of everybody's cybersecurity risk management program, right? The increase of vendor risk management, third party risk management, the categorization of risks between first party risk, third party risk, and so on. But I think you hit on the answer is just due diligence, right? It needs to be done even before you sign a contract. There needs to be, security certifications provided to you, ensuring that that third party is in line with your business objectives. They have the appropriate certifications and requirements to fulfill what you need them to fulfill. That can be, getting some sort of, vendor risk questionnaire. And I know I hate filling out vendor risk questionnaires. I know a lot of people probably do, right? But there's no other way of getting some certain information. Reading their policies, procedures, what's their data handling process. So fully kind of understanding how that company is going to protect your data, whatever type of data that you're providing them, right? Whether it's, PCI or anything in relation to PCI or other type of data, right? Because third-party vendors management isn't just PCI related; it's completely business related, right? But I think it's just understanding what their data handling practices are, what their certifications are, what they're doing, and also kind of understanding that they're keeping an eye on the forecast of the cyber threat landscape, right? Any changes that there might be in their realm that they need to adjust to, any changes in your realm that you may need to adjust to. And there's a trust relationship there, but it's definitely, I feel like, a hidden iceberg still. A lot of companies kind of just sign up and utilize different platforms, whether it's a SaaS solution, whether it's a service provider, whatever it may be. I feel like they just kind of say, yep, this is good. This does what it needs us, or, it does what we need it to do. And we move forward, right? But there's a lot of risks that, you invite while giving access to third parties into your environment. You need to know what that access is, and you need to continuously monitor it, right? And I think, that's evident from just the Target breach, right? The HVAC, contractor had access into the environment, and there was a lot of data taken. And, the most notable one that I believe started the entire snowball of third-party vendor risk management.
Yeah, absolutely. Bad actors realized very quickly that they didn't have to break firewalls down, that they could take third-party routes, literally third-party routes into their networks that were already connected. So you talked about SaaS products and so on, and we over the past 5, 8, 10 years, organizations have been moving from on-prem to cloud, but many have a mixed hybrid. And Yoel, this question's aimed at you. When you have a hybrid solution like that with cloud and on-prem, how do you manage that when it comes to PCI compliance or just security in general?
Yeah, excellent. We go back to the word inventory that has been thrown around quite often on the presentation here, but it usually comes down to understanding the technology and how that impacts your scope. Part of your understanding of your PCI environment is to determine what is your scope, what of my environment is to be compliant, and then your main priority should be is to minimize that scope, to make it as small as possible, to make your compliance efforts more affordable and simpler to address. So if you're bringing now a solution that adds a cloud base, well, that's the opposite of minimizing the scope. You're adding to it, right? Or transferring to it. But in the process of fully migrating to a new environment or a cloud environment, you're inevitably making it larger, right? So the way I would address it is basically trying to create a separation, create an understanding of if I'm bringing everything that is now cloud-based and mix it with the in-house, then how do I keep that section compliant? If it's a new technology, if it's a new type of system, if it's something that I don't have the expertise in-house to fully understand, am I doing that in a secure way? Am I actually making future-proof decisions here for the upcoming standard change, for the new solution coming out? And then after you address and you determine, okay, this is now my new scope, is you start the effort again. How do I minimize it? How do I fully transfer everything to this now more secure environment? Or if you have legacy solutions, and those of us that have been in hospitality in the past, we know that restaurants and hotels hold on to old technology for as long as they can. So it's inevitable you're going to have to deal with legacy technology, right? In the process of making that secure is, am I isolating that enough that if a breach happens and if there's a fraudulent transaction taking place or something along those lines, is am I able to bridge that gap between in-house or on-prem and cloud? Can I then make my security tools available on both environments? Maybe your SIM is really strong at collecting information for your on-prem, but is not really good at doing it for the cloud. So yeah, those decisions before you make a full migration, you need to be aware of what other technology is supporting that environment. I think that we can circle that back to a comment made earlier about compliance requirements in years. Yes, Target in 2015 was critical, especially around the impact and the noise that it created. But I think more than that, it was that liability shift that the banks or the big vendors took in 2015, 2016, where they used to charge or cover a lot of those losses for fraudulent transactions or items that were related to paying back the client. And in 2015, 2016, they said, not anymore. That is now on your side as the vendor, as the person owning that merchant ID, you are now liable for this. So those decisions of my hybrid environment is not compliant anymore, and now I also have to pay, in addition to the fines, the fraudulent transactions, the things that come up in terms of PCI, that develop a whole new appetite to be aware of, maybe I should just collapse all of this dated hybrid environment into a single, more simplified solution. Cloud-based or not, web-based or not, then maybe something that now has, in addition to tokenization, that is able to have point-to-point encryption, meaning even the token is going to be fully encrypted at that point. Or my databases in-house or my legacy systems now have to be converted. And I can wrap it up with a story. in instances where we were changing to a new payment provider, a new payment gateway, if you will. When it came down to using old transactions that were stored in-house, a lot of the times what came down to be was, I'm not allowed to absorb that information and translate it into new tokens so I can use it as reference or historical data. So you had to retain this bundle of unencrypted data and hold on to it for years because of requirements for your data retention policy or compliance in general. So those items determine if you go to the new solution or if you maintain a hybrid environment or not. Like I said, it's quite in-depth. We can get quite technical in how to protect all of that, but you have to be aware of your scope and how to minimize it and make it as small as possible, regardless of hybrid or on-prem versus cloud.
Yeah, scope reduction as much as you can. Absolutely.
That should be a priority.
Like you said at the very beginning, knowing those assets, knowing the assets that are in the cloud, knowing the assets that are on-prem, and so on. This has been a great conversation. We're down to about 9 minutes. What I would like to do is just go around the room one more time. And if you had to give one takeaway, right, to an organization that was struggling with compliance or at least trying to achieve compliance, what would be your quick and brief answer to help them along? Any of you, feel free to start with that. I got y'all.
Well, I can get us started. I think that the first on my book would be ask. Go online and just reference someone that has the experience, even from the people that might be actually reaching out to you for compliance requirements and say you now have to be compliant. They usually come with enough information with like, hey, you have to be compliant with this type of SAQ. And then you're like, well, what is an SAQ? Then you now have a starting point, right? It goes down to the basics of most security environments. But like I said, what makes PCI unique is the way you have to interact with the banks, the way you have to interact with your payment processors, the way you have to interact with leadership to understand decisions at that level. This is no longer an IT specific issue. This is a global issue that implies the whole company, right? So getting a better understanding of that. And if you happen to be the lucky person that basically was handed PCI on your desk, hey, you now have to be following this, fix it, then it is your job to be prepared to really understand what you're being delivered here, right? The level of liability, the level of implication, especially you have to submit ACQs for multiple requirements at the same time, understand the level of tier that you're in, how many transactions you have a year. And usually you have those knowledge when you're involved in those meetings, right? So you have to be involved. And if you're handed that, just see it as a career boosting energy thing that just landed on your desk. You're going to be involved in a lot more. Just embrace it and learn it because
Absolutely.
I'm passionate about it. And I understand that if you get involved, you will be.
You're right. I love that. I love that answer. Love that answer. John, do you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if any company is starting out, again, you really need to understand the whole business process. You need to understand end to end. Why are they processing credit cards? How are they processing it? The workflows are equally as important as your network flows, getting those defined. And, knowing your inventory from your data, knowing your inventory from whether it's actual, systems or servers or cloud, public cloud sources you use to process your credit card data. You need to know those, but you also need to know your support services, what your firewalls, how they protect. Also understanding the new nuances of networks security control. It's different in AWS versus Azure versus Google Cloud. So I think, you have to really kind of ask a lot of questions in the beginning, and you have to embrace it, as was mentioned. If you're going to go into this role, these are things that, even though you're putting the time in now, you're going to help your organization, but it's also stepping stones for like a future career growth. So it's really good. Yeah. And like one way you might want to start out, even if you don't want to go down like ISA, obviously you can't transfer that from organization to organization, but PCIP is kind of a good starting point for somebody, maybe just getting out there and going through. It's not an incredibly difficult test, but just the same, could be, a good starting point for somebody on helping support their organization.
Absolutely. And John, I think that advice is good. John and Yoel, right? I think that advice is good no matter what size organization you are, involved with, and or the amount of cards or transactions that are happening. So, Jimmy, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I think Yoel and John hit two really incredible points, and I was struggling to try to find one key takeaway because I think there's so many. But I think if there was one, I would say that probably one of the most important things, and I think this spans to entirety of GRC, is just getting senior leadership buy-in. Right? You can identify so many things that need to be done to be compliant with PCI, right? But if you don't have senior leadership buy-in to be able to implement certain controls, be able to enforce specific controls on other departments, because that's a lot of times what happens. You're not really going to make any headway, right? Even if it's something that's put on your desk, it's going to be really difficult to make headway in that, becoming compliant, especially with PCI. So I think getting senior leadership buy-in is paramount. And I think, understanding the scope, as to what John was saying, understand the scope of wherever you need to be compliant, what those compliant requirements are, and just communication, right? Communication to senior leadership, communication to other departments, education and training to other departments of what specific controls mean, what potential impact there are for particular controls, all that type of stuff. But I think if there was one key takeaway, I would say senior leadership buy-in, because that's pretty paramount for anything in cybersecurity.
I would agree with that as well. Those were all three of those takeaways, I think, were just fantastic. So thank you for that. Two very important things before we end this session. Three, actually. First, I want to thank all of you, John, Jimmy, Yoel, Ashley, for being here. She's running a lot of the stuff behind the scenes as well. Thank you so much for being here. Means more to us than you know, and I feel that people have takeaways from this. So, second, we do have a document. It's PCI mistakes and pitfalls, because many times you can spend money and go down the wrong path because maybe you're steered in the wrong direction. So we have that document at Appalachia, and I actually had a little bit of part in help creating that. To get that, we have the directions at the bottom. Just simply email info@appalachiatech.com with the subject of PCI webinar handout, and you can get that as well. So my most important thing that I want to end with is a question to John, right? We were talking before we started, and I learned recently that John sometimes does some test tasting for Wendy's. And I'm curious for all of those, because I'm going there after, as soon as this is done, as soon as I hit the end button, I'm headed to Wendy's. What is the best menu item, John? That's probably the most important thing that we need to know. What should I order today?
Okay, well, this is open to interpretation, but bacon makes everything better. So, my favorite is the Baconator. It's a cholesterol bomb, so I would be careful with that. But and there's some other stuff I can't say I've taste tested that might be coming down the pike, but all I could say is that anything with bacon is great. And some of the favorites that I have, but they have great chicken sandwiches. The salads are good. And one of our competitors, McDonald's, no longer actually carries salads. So if you're a little bit more health conscious, that might be a good reason to go there. And so just some ideas. I'm giving my pitch on it, but it's awesome. And I do like some of the new breakfast burritos too. So if you get a chance to check them out, so there's a lot of good stuff.
So I feel like I have to go there for lunch, dinner, and breakfast tomorrow. So thank you. Thank you for that.
And if you eat too much of it, we might have to see what you're looking like in a little while.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everything. And again, for those at the bottom, feel free to email us, and you can get the document. And thank you to everybody watching. The questions and the interaction really keeps us going. It's what we thrive off of. We are here literally to educate the public as much as we can. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here. Ashley, is there anything that you would like to include, or any takeaways? What's your favorite Wendy's item, Ashley?
I mean, my make or break on friendships is, do you dip your French fries in a Frosty? And if it's a no, I don't know if we can be close friends.
Ashley's going to be leaving the podcast here very abruptly. I'm just
salty sweet, man.
I do dip my fries in the Wendy's chili. It is unreal.
That's a good take. That's a good
definitely
take.
worth it. So,
Yep.
all right, everybody, I'm
right.
going to hit the end stream button. Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Bye-bye now.